So if you look in your documents for week 1, you'll see a lot of handouts that you need to have printed out. You'll also want probably some colored pencils so that you can really kind of follow along with what we're about to do here. And so this worksheet is going to refer to our first manipulative that you will need for this class. So I'm going to move this away. So the first manipulative we're going to look at are called pattern blocks. So here are some of the more common pattern block colors / choices. So we're going to play around with these. You'll need to do this on your own. I'm just going to kind of demonstrate some of this. So these are one of the most common manipulatives that can really be found in most classrooms. They're relatively inexpensive, so you'll find that most school districts will probably have these on hand for you when you get to the point where you are teaching. But these are the main colors. The purple ones are kind of the pains to set up, so bear with me here. That's not right. All right, so hopefully you have your own set of these. You need to get those ASAP, as I mentioned earlier, for week 1 if you don't have those yet. I'm going to slide these around. There's different ways you can fit these together, but I'm trying to make hexagons for all of them. All right, so let's say that the hexagon was a hole. Okay, now we're going to alter what the hole is, but for now we're going to talk about the hexagon being a hole. So if the hexagon is a hole, what would each of the red pieces be and why? Notice they would each be 1/2, right? And why are they 1/2? Because we know that if we have 2 equal pieces and they make the whole, then each of them must have been 1/2. Okay, so notice this is a representation of an area model, right? We have a hole and we're splitting that hole up into pieces. Here we have parallelograms. Okay, so the blue represents how many of those pieces would equal our whole if the whole is still the yellow hexagon, 3. So each of these blues represent 1/3. Each of these browns represent 1/4, right? Because 4 pieces make a whole. Each of the green represents 1/6 if the yellow hexagon is the whole. And then last but not least, these little purple guys, there are 12 of them that would make the whole if the hexagon was the whole. So each of those purples in this scenario would be 1/12. Okay, but we want to make sure that we vary that. In other words, this is not always going to be the whole. Okay, so let's say that this were the whole instead. Okay, so if this were the whole, then each brown would not be 1/4 anymore. I'm going to move these down. Then each brown would actually be representative of 1/2, right? And each green would be representative of 1/3. And I'm going to slide these down, maybe. Got too many there. And then each of these would be representative of 1/6. Okay, but what if I asked you what a blue would represent? That's a little more challenging if the red is the whole, right? So we have to kind of figure out if we can talk about equal size pieces and splitting things up into pieces. So just one more. What if the blue is the whole? So I'm going to slide all this stuff down. If the blue is the whole, then each green represents what? 1/2, right? Because 2 pieces make a whole. Okay. So anyway, my point is you wouldn't use pattern blocks and always maintain that this is your whole. Okay, you would want to vary that quite a bit. But no matter what your whole is, you're splitting that up into smaller size pieces. All right, so let's go ahead and take, I'm going to slide these blocks over. Let's go ahead and take out our fraction action 15 worksheet. Now I'm just going to do like one of these with you, and then hopefully you're going to work on those on your own. So if I want to show 1/6, I can use my blocks if I'm a more visual person. In other words, like if I'm trying to really find out which color I should be using / shape. But remember, the key would be to split this piece up into 6 pieces. So notice 1/6 would be one of these guys, right? One of the green. Okay, so let's skip over to part D because it's a little more interesting since it's got 5 pieces. So if I want 5/6, then notice I would still want these green pieces, right? But I would want how many of them to represent 5/6? I would want 5 of them, right? So I'm going to go ahead and use, I'm kind of OCD, so I'm going to use my ruler here to make this look nice. So you're going to have exercises in this class where you have to show me that you understand how to use pattern blocks. And so when you do, try to make it look as neat as you can. Okay, if you can do that without a ruler, that's fine. But definitely make sure that you label what you have. So notice here I have 1/6. Each of these represent 1/6 for a total notice of 6/6. And then if I want to show 5/6, I would shade in 5 of them. And notice this is a good representation of why 5/6 is really close to 1. Notice that almost all of this hexagon in this case is shaded in. So this worksheet is really just going to have you always assume that the hexagon is the whole, but remember we can vary and change that quite a bit. Okay, so that is the kind of work that I would want to see on a test or anything that you turn into me. Okay. Notice on this worksheet there's lots of opportunities for you to try out the different size pieces. So for the 1/2 you'd be using the red pieces, right? For the 5/12 you got to think to yourself which was the color that 12 of them made the whole. That was purple, right? And so on and so forth. For these thirds, remember blue was the color that 3 pieces made the whole. And then in the end, see if you can also determine which one is the biggest. Now notice this is a visual exercise, right? Like, so whichever ones fill up the most space would be the largest, and whichever ones fill up the smallest space would be the smallest. So on this right here that I'm pointing out, I actually don't want you to use common denominators or a calculator or anything like that. I want you strictly using area. So like which of, this is greater than, right? So the biggest one goes here. So which one of these, once you're finished, fills in the most area? And then down here on the right-hand side, this would be the smallest one. So which of these of the whole, fills in the smallest area or shades in the smallest area? All right, and then I also want, so I'm going to kind of put that off to the side and you can finish that up on your own. I also want to look at the other part that kind of looks like this. So let's talk about the fraction action 25 worksheet. So we can also use concepts of area to talk about equality. And again, this is talked about before we ever discuss the concept of common denominators or anything like that. So I'm going to take maybe a relatively easier one. So I'm going to start with 1/2. Okay, so I'm going to start with 1/2. Notice I'm going to shade it in red because if my hexagon is my whole, then the red trapezoids would be 1/2, since 2 of them make a whole, 2 equal size pieces. So we can talk about, if we want to, these are going to be equivalent fractions. So I'm going to start with 1/2 here, and I want to talk about what different things I could say about it being equivalent. Now, I could say that 1/2 is equivalent to what? So the first question is, what do each of these green pieces represent if the yellow is the whole, if the yellow hexagon is the whole? Notice they're each 1/6, right? So that would be 3/6. Okay, so we could draw that with a picture, okay? But that's not the only answer we could come up with. Couldn't we also say that with the brown pieces that this fills in the same amount of area? So notice what this would represent, right? What do each of these brown shapes represent? They represent 1/4, okay? And so 2 of them would be equivalent to 1/2. Okay, notice I'm doing this without any knowledge really of common denominators. So let's go ahead and draw out the 1/4. Now I'm just going to eyeball this one. I'm not going to measure it or be super detailed, but I'm going to label these each as a 1/4. And then with your colored pencils, I'd want you to show which color. Now notice I technically actually could fill in any two pieces here, but I'm going to make sure that I shade in the same area or the same section, just honestly as to not overly confuse my students if this is what I'm teaching. Okay, in other words, I wouldn't probably shift the two pieces here or something like that. Okay, so notice in picture form, I've really truly showed using area that 1/2 is actually equivalent to 2/4, which we already kind of knew that it was, right? Okay, so for the remainder of this exercise, I want you to finish fraction action 15, and I also want you to complete this one, and the trick is I don't want you to use a half again. Okay, so you can use this example that I gave you, but for the 3 other ones that you're going to do on your own, I don't want you to use 1/2. So you have to use something else. So an example might be you start off with 2/3 or something, and you come up with an equivalent for that using a different color block, but coloring in the same section.